Hey there, welcome back to the realm of history for tonight's review on chapter 14. A couple of things that we're going to talk about here before we get going. The agenda tonight, of course, we'll have some key advice like we always do. We're going to go over some key terms and figures. Very important AP advice tonight. We got the SAQ tomorrow. And of course, a little bit of question and answer session at the end. Make sure you check in with me in the comments. Let me know that you're here. Okay, let's get into the key advice. I think this is the most important part of anything that we do. Number one, make sure you complete your review sheet, squeeze yourself off of the review sheet, but also read through your notes. Not only one time, not two times, but multiple or several times. Make sure you're reading through your notes, getting yourself ready for the quiz. Make sure you've done the reading of AMSCO. Make sure you've done the reading of all the sections, getting yourself as ready and equipped for tomorrow's quiz assessment as possible. Number two, we want to talk about, hey, pray for the right things, right? Make sure that we're not praying for success on this quiz. We know there are so many more important things to think about, but I do think it's fair to ask the good Lord for, guidance to use our talents that we have to the fullest. And we've been blessed with so many talents, and we're so lucky and fortunate to be where we are. We got to make sure that we say the prayer of gratitude, thanking God for all the great things and all the blessings that have been bestowed upon us. Finally, not finally yet, but in the middle, be here now. Tomorrow's a Tuesday quiz. Shouldn't really have a whole lot going on other than when you come in the realm, popping in history and being here now, making sure you're getting ready for the assessment. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be a challenge. It's always meant to be a challenge. It's an AP class. So get your mind right. Be here now. Hey, number 4. Make sure you say thank you to your parents tonight at some point in time. If you haven't done so already, make sure you're doing that pretty much every day. Where you really should be making that a daily, several times a day. Make sure you're expressing your gratitude to your parents. They do a lot for you. I know as a parent, there's a lot of sacrifice that you do, and you'll someday learn about that. But until that point, make sure you express your gratitude to your parents. If you need to stop what you're doing right now and go do that, that's more important than what we're talking about here. Number 5, don't shy away from the challenge. Don't be a Skipper McGee tomorrow. Make sure that you're there if you can be. If you're sick, you're sick. But if not, don't skip out. Make sure you come, do your due diligence, take your quiz, and rise to the occasion. Don't shy away from the challenge. Meet the challenge. Be ready for the challenge and give it your best effort. That's all you can ever do. Okay, some selected key terms and figures. I'm not going to go through all the key terms and figures. Some of them I think are pretty straightforward, pretty basic, but I'm going to go through some that I thought would be helpful in looking at what's on the quiz for tomorrow. The first one is simony. Some people say simony, but simony, the practice of selling positions in the church. This is basically where bishops were selling positions in the church. Now, I want to make sure that we understand that usually the bishops that were selling positions in the church were ones that were appointed through lay investiture, right? Those are guys appointed by kings, not by the church. So this was a big issue. Lay investiture, I think, had a direct relationship to simony. So in this class, like I said, you can't just know the basic definition. You got to know the big picture. You got to think about critically, all right, I know simony, but what caused simony? How did simony get to where it is? Oh, well, it's lay investiture. What is lay investiture? Oh, that's where it wasn't the church who were appointing these bishops. It were the kings, and they were appointing their friends, their allies, their relatives. A lot of these people weren't really qualified to be in those positions. So that was a big picture problem. Next, we're going to talk about the Inquisition. Inquisition was a very, very serious thing going on in Spain. The church in Spain, in particular, they were using court cases to persecute Jewish and Muslim practitioners. This is out of control. They were anybody who spoke out against the church, anybody who wouldn't follow church laws, they would put them on trial, basically. They would torture them sometimes. And if they were convicted, or maybe if they confessed, some of the folks would be burned at the stake. So, this was kind of a really touchy subject going on in Spain during this time. Your book had a lot to say about it. It had some pictures of torture going on, so on and so forth. Next is the Reconquista, also in Spain. Reconquista means reconquest. This was an organized effort by the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, to name a few, to drive the Muslims out of Spain. So really, Spain was trying to get anybody who wasn't Catholic or anybody who wasn't Christian, trying to drive them to the outskirts. There was a lot of this going on during that time period. The Crusades. The Crusades were a big part of this chapter, and really there were about 8 to 10 crusades. Some of them were really inconsequential. Like your book talks about the Children's Crusade, which was close to 1,000 kids under the age of 14 trying to go to the Holy Land. So they got on ships. Nobody ever saw them again. It's wild. But the first through fourth are the crusades you really should focus on for this quiz. Here's what you want to know. And I'm not going to go through each of them tonight. I'm not. So please don't ask in the questions. We kind of went over it today, and they're all in the book. They're in the notes. But the first, second, third, and fourth crusades, you got to know what the goal of them was. What was the goal of each of those crusades, and what was the outcome of each? I'll do an example for the first crusade. The goal of the first crusade was to capture the Holy Land and drive the Muslims out of the Holy Land. It was a short-term success because in 1099, the Crusaders captured the city of Jerusalem and held it for a short time. It was then recaptured, though, by the Muslims. So we got to understand that, for example, if we know that about the first crusade, then we should be able to do a similar kind of talk through on the second, third, and fourth crusades. Next is the Magna Carta. Magna Carta is a really big document. It has a really big impact on our Constitution, our Bill of Rights today. So the Magna Carta was a document guaranteed basic legal rights to people in England, such as no taxation without representation. Well, what does that really mean? We learn about that quite a bit in U.S. history, but what does that mean? It means the king can't raise the taxes without giving the people some say in government. That's really what it is. Don't raise taxes on the people unless you're going to give them some say, some participation in government. Magna Carta guarantees basic legal rights. You have the right to a trial by jury of your peers, right? Things of that nature. Basic legal rights. It was a big game changer. John the Soft Sword signed it. He was forced to sign it by the nobles. He didn't want to, but he was kind of a pushover. He got whooped up by the French many times, and the nobles kind of controlled him very easily. So that's something that you really need to consider there. Next is Parliament. Speaking of English government and law, Parliament is a legislative body. So they make laws, they introduce bills and laws in medieval England. So Parliament is a legislative body, which means making or passing laws in the medieval England. Next is the term vernacular. Vernacular is very simple. It's just common local language. Many writers such as Chaucer, Alighieri, etc. use this during this time period that we're learning about, 1000 to 1500. Basically, the languages like English, Spanish, French, Italian. These writers, these authors were speaking these languages, and they were also writing in these languages. Prior to this, almost everybody wrote in Latin. So people who lived in France who didn't speak Latin anymore, or England who didn't speak Latin, could now be able to read some of these major works of literature. Next is a big meeting called the Estates General. It's not one individual meeting. It's a meeting that happens every so often in France that's to help decide on big picture issues. The Estates General was a meeting of all three social classes in France. It was called into play for important issues, like I said. You had the church was the first estate, or the upper class. Nobles were the second estate, and then commoners were the third estate. Now on to some key figures. Pope Urban II. Most important thing to know about Pope Urban II is he, what we say, commissions the First Crusade. When we say commissions, he kind of helps get it going, helps promote it. He's not going and fighting, but he's commissioning it to be done. He's talking to the kings. He's talking to the lords. He's helping the knights get out there and fight for the crusading effort. The Crusaders came up against a pretty good military leader, Saladin. Saladin was the Muslim leader during the Crusades. He's very successful. He was not defeated. He came to a truce with Richard the Lionhearted, but He was never defeated entirely. William the Conqueror. He's from Normandy, right? He leads the Norman invasion of England. That's where the word Normandy comes from, northern France. Okay. So he led the Norman conquest of England. And once he took it over, he claimed all of England as his personal property, meaning he's the first true king of the entire kingdom of England. True king. Okay. Next is Henry II. Henry II was the king of England. He married Eleanor of Aquitaine, which granted him a portion of land in France, which was called Aquitaine. And then he was also the father to Richard the Lionhearted, who fought against Saladin in the Third Crusade. And also he was the father of John the Softsword, who we just learned signed the Magna Carta, but also lost many battles and wars against the French King Philip. Speaking of that, here is John. John was forced to sign the Magna Carta by the English nobles and lost many battles and territories to the French during his reign. His mom was the famous female of the Middle Ages, one of the most famous women in medieval Europe, Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was the wife of Henry II. She was Queen of England, therefore. And then she was also mother of two English kings, Richard and John, who we talked about extensively tonight. Okay, we're going to get into some AP advice. You know that you have the SAQ tomorrow. So I want to remind you that an SAQ has a prompt. Your prompt tomorrow is going to be a document. Okay, it's going to be a document. I'm looking at it right now. It's about a paragraph and a half if you really add it all up. Yeah, it's about that. It's not entirely too long, but there will be 3 questions. That's the norm. 3 questions for every prompt on the AP portion, especially when it's an SAQ. And you're going to need to use ACE. Answer the question. That's the A. C, cite evidence, historical evidence to support your answer. Where do you get that evidence? Sometimes it could be from the document. Usually, though, it's from your historical understanding, things that you've been taught in the class, things that you were assigned to read in the class, like AMSCO for 1, or your textbook for 2. And then also, I think what's important here is that you need to explain, that's the E, how your evidence definitely supports your answer or claim. What is going to be the topic of the prompt? There's 3 things I really wanted to clue you in on here. So if you're writing these things down, go ahead and pay attention right now. The prompt focuses on 3 things. Number 1, anti-Semitism in Europe. We talked about anti-Semitism in the notes. AMSCO had a section on anti-Semitism as well. So that's going to be one of the topics of your SAQ. The other thing that's intertwined with the anti-Semitism in the prompt is the bubonic plague. And a lot of Europeans are playing the blame game, trying to find a scapegoat who was responsible for this plague. It's terrible. And then we have urbanization in Europe also being a part of this prompt. So you have anti-Semitism, the bubonic plague, and urbanization, which is people moving into cities, the growth and creation of major cities in Europe, all coming together in this one prompt. Okay, so that's what you're going to be writing about. The author of the prompt, if you wanted to do some research, the author of the prompt, it's from a book that he wrote. His name was Conrad of Megenberg. Conrad of Megenberg. He's from Germany. So he's going to write about this time period in the 1300s, bubonic plague in Europe. Okay, Realm family, we're going to get into the question and answer session. I'm going to go here to the comments. Oh boy, we got Sir Ducky back again. All right, a lot of ballers in here. Thank you for joining. I appreciate it. Still, numbers are way down, though, from where we started the year. The first live review, we had 130. Now, we have only 70. So let's see. Are there any big-time questions? Here we go. What is the Battle of Hastings? Battle of Hastings, 1066. This is the Normans versus the Anglo-Saxons, right? and the Normans win. This guy named Harold Godwinson tried to claim the throne. He got shot through the eye socket with an arrow. It's one of the most gruesome things I've read about. It's pretty bad. Can you go over Parliament and its? Well, Parliament I went through in the terms. I said it was basically a legislative body in England. And what Parliament does is it creates laws. So what you got to understand is there's like a power exchange between Parliament and the king. Parliament is put into play kind of when the Magna Carta comes around, sort of limits the king's power because they have power to pass bills and laws. And so Parliament and the king are constantly vying for control, going back and forth. It kind of puts a limitation on the king's power. And so that's one of the key things that you want to understand there. It's actually a real question. In what ways did the Crusades help bring knowledge from the Islamic world to Europe, and how did this influence Europe's development afterward? Probably won't be on this quiz, but because this is an intellectual question, I'm going to answer it. Number one, trade. Trade was huge. A lot of the Crusaders, a lot of the lords and knights that ended up in places like Iraq, Palestine region, they were becoming accustomed to really new spices, new metals, new clothing styles. So these are all big time things that eventually culturally diffused into Europe. How did this influence Europe's development afterward? Well, obviously it changed their food, changed their coinage system. And then I think the most important change is education. The Muslims really kept a great deal of libraries and ancient books. And so Christian scholars in Europe began to study those, and it became rather important. Sir Ducky. Saint Francis of Assisi was a Catholic saint. He was really known for like being a lover of all animals, and he was really into nature. But he founded an order called the Franciscan Friars, and so he just came up with an order of Franciscan monks that would travel, and they would try to gain Christian converts, basically. I already talked about this in class. I'm not going to be telling you. I told you that throughout the chapter. I had you star things in the notes, or I kind of showed when I was teaching, what were the important things to study on the board. First and Second Crusades, I would say not so similar. Here's why. The First Crusade, Anna B. Ballin, was kind of starting off the Crusades, right? And it was very successful, right? In 1099, the Crusaders actually captured Jerusalem and took it over, and they divided it up into 4 different territories. They gave it out to 4 European kings to rule. Then eventually, though, over the course of time, the Muslims reconquered it. So the Second Crusade is similar in it was trying to recapture the territory, but it was unsuccessful. So I would definitely say that they were not similar due to the success factor of the first and the failure of the second. Inventions and events that helped end the Middle Ages. Well, one of the big ones was the longbow, because the longbow was powerful enough to knock a knight off of its horse. So if a knight gets knocked off of its horse, that with all that body armor, they're going to most likely not be able to get up, which kind of makes them ineffective on the battlefield. Then what you have is the bubonic plague. The bubonic plague caused mass destruction. I mean, we had a whole insert about that, and we've already learned about it, but it killed, almost 2/3 of the people in Europe. So that really ends what's going on in the Middle Ages. The 100 Years' War, constant fighting for over 100 years. I think it was more like 115, 118 years. The 100 Years' War went from 1337 to 1453. So it was quite a long time of fighting back and forth. And that really did a lot to end, of course, the Middle Ages as well. Okay, it's kind of the same answer there, right? A very similar question. You guys just had it at the same time. So this, what I just said for the last question would definitely be valid here. Alfred the Great was an English king. He was most well known for defending very, very well against the Viking invasions. The Viking invasions coming from Scandinavia, he was really good at keeping those Viking invasions at bay. That's Alfred the Great. Romanesque architecture is basically a style of architecture that came into play before Gothic, and it's just meaning how it sounds. It's architecture that was like Roman architecture. So a lot of concrete work, a lot of heavy pillars, archways. Remember, the Romans used a lot of archways. So Romanesque architecture is symbolic of Roman architecture. The goals of the Crusades: number one, recapture the Holy Land. Number two, drive the Muslims out of the Holy Land. And number three is kind of an interesting one. Kings wanted to really stop knights fighting against each other. So they're like, wait a second. If we have knights fighting feudal wars here for their lords, why don't we find a common enemy, the Muslims, and let's get these knights to team up, and we'll go on a crusade. We'll get all the knights teamed together, and that'll definitely help us defeat our enemy. And that's kind of what they focused on doing there. So those were some of the goals of the Crusades. Good or bad? It's hard to answer that. They were not very successful, I will say that. They were actually utter failures. Crusades were not successful. They were pretty bad. I would say they're bad overall if you study history, because you have Christian men, you have the Pope commissioning them. The idea of gaining access to the Holy Land, I think, is a good idea, but we have slaughters and massacres going on during the Crusades, like killing innocent women, children, elderly. Christian knights are doing this. Muslims are doing it back. So now I would say they're overall bad, and they really didn't accomplish much at all. Causes of the Great Schism, I wouldn't get too worried about it. It's just about who's the rightful pope. You had some people thinking that Clement is the pope. You have some people thinking that this guy's the pope. I wouldn't get too worried or bogged down about it, but it's an issue over who's the rightful pope. We had two different groups, the split. This side thinks this guy should be the pope. This guy thinks this guy should be the pope. These guys are from France. These guys are from Italy, right? And so they had ended up with two popes at one time. That was the schism. So it's all about who's the rightful pope. Doesn't even matter who's the pope. It's just the fact that they were arguing over that. Lack of organization, conflict in the church. Yeah. So burghers, they don't fit in the Estates General. They're not in the Estates General. They would be, all right, merchants would be commoners. Okay. So if they were in France, right? They're not always in France, though. They could be in Germany. They could be in England. The burghers, they were outside of the feudal system. They were town dwellers. So they lived in towns and cities, and they bought and sold goods. Well, first of all, the difference is time. It take place at two different time periods. The second crusade was a major failure. They lost entirely. The third crusade, they put a really big effort together. They got the king of France, the king of Germany, the king of England to combine their forces. We know that they all didn't make it, but Richard ended up leading that cohort, and he fought valiantly. He didn't get beat, but he kind of came to a peace treaty with Saladin. So neither side really won. Here's what I'll tell you, though. The peace treaty, the truce, says that, all right, the Muslims would regain or remain in control of the Holy Land, and that Christians could come and go freely to worship. I think that's a loss on the Christian side, because the goal was to regain the territory. And if you don't fulfill that goal, then it's an overall loss. Because now, okay, you can come and go freely, but you can't control the territory. So you really don't have control of the holy sites. That's the difference between the two, though. How did guilds influence business practices? Well, guilds make better products because what happens is when there's a guild, you have levels, you have an apprentice, you have a journeyman, you have a master. So what it does is it makes it so that you know that there's going to be quality work and the workers are going to get paid right, they're going to be protected, they're going to have, you know, good quality workmanship. The products that they're going to use are going to be quality. So the guilds are like labor unions. There's quality control going on there, and there's best business practices being put in place. But they protect the workers, is what the idea of a guild is early on. And so they influence business practices because business owners then had to think about, okay, well, I have to make sure that I'm not overworking this person, or I'm got to make sure that I respect this person's rights to this and that. So it kind of set the tempo of working conditions being more suitable for the worker. I think that would be its biggest influence on business practices. It's going to cost the owners more in the long run. Muslim scholars were definitely linked to the revival of learning in Europe because of the libraries that they ran. Muslim scholars were some of the best in the world, and they reproduced and they translated all of the ancient works of the Greeks and Romans, which they then housed in libraries in southern Spain. So a lot of the Christian scholars would go study at Muslim universities and libraries in southern Spain, which is how they influenced this revival of learning in Europe. Got you, Karina. I pretty much figured that you would hear the other answer, so that's good. Yeah, the AP portion will have only the SAQ. That's it. No MCQs or anything. That just the SAQ. Why was it such a great failure? The Fourth Crusade? Well, the Fourth Crusade was another attempt to get to the Holy Land. The armies of Crusaders never even made it close to the Holy Land. They ended up stopping in Constantinople and looting Constantinople, which was a Christian city at the time. So it was just an utter failure. There was a lot going on. There's a much deeper layer to the story. I don't think you want to get bogged down into it. There was the emperor of Constantinople at this time. He sent a letter to the Pope at the time, and there was just a lot of miscommunication. The Crusaders took it the wrong way. They start looting the city. What you need to know is that it was a failure because they never even made it to the Holy Land. That's the idea there. Well, urbanization, it just means people moving into cities, you know, and in Europe, you had this urbanization process. You had towns and cities developing and growing. The burghers are living in towns, the merchants are living in towns, serfs are escaping, trying to move to cities. So you have a lot of people conglomerating in one area. And we know that this can be bad if disease hits, right? So the urbanization process connected to the bubonic plague because it helped, well, I don't want to say help, but it led to the disease spreading much easier because people are living in cities in what we call close proximity, meaning they're living very closely together. I mean, John Wycliffe was, he's basically a major, what we call Christian reformer. He argued that the church was kind of out of hand. They were having a lot of conflict, a lot of controversy. And he says, really, you should follow the Bible more than you should follow the Pope. And he says the Bible has more authority than the Pope. He says, really, Jesus is the head of the church, not the Pope. So he kind of called into question like the Pope and the format of the church, which, you know, at this time, if you did that, you became a target of the church and they would come after you. Jan Hus, very similar to John Wycliffe. I mean, they both kind of had the same ideology. They're both Christian reformers. Well, I do use shampoo, but I don't need much of it. It's like really what they call a very small dollop, nonetheless. Okay. It looks like that was That's not a real question. So are there any other real questions? We've been on for about 30 minutes, which is our norm. If anybody has a further question, I will certainly go ahead and stay on. Well, I'm not seeing any come in. I just want to say thank you for joining. Yes, something like that, dear. It's been pretty good. I'm sorry I had to come a little bit late. I had coach my daughter's volleyball game, but I just want to say thank you to all of you, and hopefully you'll be ready for tomorrow's big quiz. It's going to be a challenge. Make sure that you're ready. Do your due diligence, and make sure you have a great night. God bless all of you.